So, talk about Dave. You can see there on the other side. So, Dave's done a fair bit actually. So, he's a recognised international expert, done a lot of work across a number of industries. He's the managing director at ForgeWorks and an adjunct research fellow at Griffith. And he's the host of one of the co-hosts of the Safety at Work podcast. If you have or haven't listened to that, I recommend you do that. Really good because it promotes an evidence-based practice and approach to safety. He's worked as a safety executive in oil and gas, construction and rail for 20 years, and he's got a PhD in safety science and is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. Probably more than that, he's a good guy, really smart, and he's generously shared his time with us tonight, and certainly around what does HRO mean for the mining industry and where we can step forwards with that. So Dave, I'll hand over to you now.
All right, we're going to kick off with the lecture bit, or do you want to talk about the Brady report first?
I jumped ahead. So the context. So for those that aren't necessarily from the mining industry, so the Brady report was released in December 2019. It was commissioned by the Department for Natural Resources and Mines, really focusing, there's been a spate of fatalities over 17 years, look at all the data, come up with some recommendations and release it to industry to then help move industry forwards. If I'm fair and listening to what the industry's talked about, industry was underwhelmed at best, I think. And you can see here's a list of the recommendations, and highlighted there in red was this recommendation that the industry should adopt the principles of high reliability organisational theory. So I've been around mining for a while, been around safety for a while, and that was very new for me as a concept. And talking to a few people within industry as well, they are on the similar front. So it created a good opportunity then for us to, okay, well, where can we get some information and what can we do with that information to respond to the Brady report? Also, if we think about it, this was December 2019. We're now in April 2020. We're close on the 5 months now, and there's probably not as much activity happening as what it could have been. The coronavirus obviously is impacting on a lot of things, but also we can't drop the ball on this one. So that's a bit of that background and context there. And now I'll hand over to Dave, and you can go forwards, mate, and do your thing.
Great, thanks, Christian. So thanks everyone for joining. What I'm going to try and do is only talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then what I really want to do to deliver on what the title of this webinar is, which is high reliability organisation theory applied within the mining industry, is really have some discussion and that's specific to your operating context in your organisations. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the background of the theory and where it came from and what it says. And what I suspect is some people will know a fair bit about HRO theory and they'll probably be a bit underwhelmed about the information. Then some people will know a little bit and it'll fill in some gaps, and then some people won't know much at all, and they might get quite a bit out of it. So we'll talk at the end about some opportunities to further enhance kind of how we continue this discussion and how we provide each of you with more information that matches what you already know and what you might do. But that's just the context of what I'm trying to do. So HRO theory sort of popped up in the mid 1980s, and what happened is after 3 Mile Island in the US, which was the nuclear incident in 1979. People started really thinking about how we can manage safety, and 3 Mile Island was what they sort of called this first complex incident, where none of the theories around at the time for safety could really explain how that might have been avoided. And so you had a theory that came out from Charles Perrow called normal accident theory that people might be familiar with. And what he basically said is that because of all these complex technologies that we're now working with, and remember we're in the 1980s, that major incidents are just inevitable. You cannot do enough engineering, you cannot do enough risk management. There's latent vulnerabilities built into these complex systems and complex technologies, and accidents will happen. And it's kind of pointless to try to avoid it. If you want to have these technologies, you've got to be prepared to live with the accidents. And so that was normal accident theory. And so then a couple of researchers at the Berkeley School of Management, so Rocklin and Roberts and Laporte, they said, well, hang on a minute, that can't be right, because there must be operations that are around that are running high risk, complex, tightly coupled activities with a really high level of reliability, or they're running them with less accidents than we feel like those would normally have. So they spent a couple of years in the mid-'80s, and they started by going into US air traffic control, and this photo here of US Navy aircraft carriers. And so what they said is, like, planes aren't crashing into each other in the air very often, and there's very, very few incidents ever on these aircraft carriers. Hugely complex, hugely dynamic environment. So they went in for a couple of years in the mid-'80s and tried to understand how these organisations operate and what are the characteristics that they're displaying that might provide some insights about how they manage to be so incredibly reliable, even though they're working with these very complex operations. And just to give you a sense of that, that aircraft carrier in the picture there, they move planes and land planes and take them off all the time. And they only touch one plane into another. So picture like wingtips, bumping in or touching each other, like one in every 10,000 movements, and they designed it as basically the takeoff intervals, the movement intervals, the movement of the deck, the water, the weather conditions, sort of hostile enemies. They really don't have any problems, as you'd expect. And the same in air traffic control. So they went in. They'll talk about what they concluded, but that was where it sort of came from. And what was happening, because there was so much going on at the time, like Piper Alpha, the Exxon Valdez, the Challenger space shuttle incident around the mid-'80s, everyone was really interested in safety, and particularly in the US. So that meant that a lot of psychology academics, a lot of management academics, and a lot of kind of heavy, I suppose, academic horsepower was going into trying to describe how to make things more safe. One of the good things about HRO theory that I really like is that it was the first theory that tried to study safe operations and then describe how to kind of keep them safe and what makes them safe. Every safety theory that had come before looked at accidents and disasters and tried to work backwards from there and say, what did we find in these accident situations? And so if we don't do them, then we're going to be safe. And for those familiar with more contemporary theories around things like safety 2 would say that, looking at what is going well and what's going right and learning from that to try to build more success into our organizations. So HRO sort of deserves some credit, and the original authors, for being the first theory to really look at really safe operations and try to understand why they're safe. The term, Carl Weick, who picked it up, started talking about mindfulness in relation to the characteristics of a HRO organisation. So now we might be familiar with the term mindfulness in relation to safety, but this is where it came from. Mindfulness about safety, for organisational mindfulness, collective mindfulness, actually came out of HRO theory. And so since then, I went looking, and this hasn't really been spoken about in the mining industry. I went looking through the literature, and I found one book chapter from a 2019 book which suggests that maybe HRO might be an idea that may work in the mining industry. But really, there's been very little application of this theory, at least in the academic world. I'm not sure in practice, and people will tell me if there's stuff happening in mining companies in Australia or internationally, but there really hasn't been much done in mining. A little bit done in oil and gas and other resource industries, but it's been really heavily studied within these industries on that slide. So nuclear power, air traffic control and military, like I've said, high-speed rail, and then emergency services, wildland firefighting and healthcare, particularly in emergency departments, looking at how those emergency departments function in such complex and dynamic environments with relatively surprisingly good outcomes. So that's kind of like the overview of the theory. And so what I want to do is say, well, what did these researchers find? What are the practical characteristics and the principles of a high reliability organisation? So the original work in the 80s, like I said, by Rocklin, Laporte and Roberts, they came up with these conclusions, but they weren't trying to develop a theory. They were just trying to describe why these aircraft carriers and air traffic control operations were safe. So they weren't saying we're going to develop some big theory, we're going to basically set people off. But what happened in the early 90s is Carl Weick and Jade Sutcliffe picked it up. And people might be familiar with Weick and Sutcliffe, and Carl Weick's basically written for 2 decades now about HRO theory. He picked it up and turned their findings and deepened them and studied them in other applications outside of what they'd originally studied, and then came up with these 5 principles for high reliability organisations. And these will be the principles that Brady is referring to in the Brady report, that he's saying that the mining industry should adopt these types of principles in the way that they run their operations. So what I'll do is just run through these 5 and give you a sense of what they mean. And remember with this is some of these you might go, oh, well, duh, that's sort of course that's to do with good safety. But we're sort of talking 30 years ago when these ideas were coming up. So this first one is this preoccupation with failure. So organisations, even if things are going well, they're constantly cautious about what could go wrong. So this was later, I suppose, evolved in the early 2000s by Hopkins to be chronic unease, and I'm sure a number of people on the call will be familiar with the idea of chronic unease. That's come out of this type of idea of mindfulness and preoccupation with failure. So what it means is if an organisation's got a preoccupation with failure, it won't gloss over the weak signals. It will invest time in near misses. So near miss reporting and near miss investigation came out of HRO theory. And it will really try to understand what could go wrong and how to avoid it, and then really pick up on the really subtle differences. So in mining, it might be something like, oh, geez, why are we down 3% on tonnage today? Like, what's going on in our operation? Why? So really subtle operational changes. The organisation will raise alarm bells in the operation to go, something's not going to plan here. What is it? Do we understand? Do we understand it, and do we understand it well? So that's this idea about preoccupation with failure. The second idea there is reluctance to simplify interpretation. So this is the example of the Macondo well blowout, where the guys are doing the well test, they're getting some pressure loss, they put it down to the bladder effect of the underground reservoir, they don't think about whether or not the well's actually sealed, and you kill 11 people. So a high reliability organisation will never simplify pieces of information. It will always look for the underlying meaning. And so organisations have a lot of things like cross-checking, a lot of things like, job rotation. So if you think about the aircraft carrier, lots of cross-check going on. If you look at the communication between the flight deck and the pilots and air traffic control, lots of cross-checking, reading out headings and bearings and distances and altitudes, pilot, co-pilot type of communication. So when you think about like cross-checking activities in mining operations, this is the focus on the genuine focus on things like isolations, like checking of isolations, permitting processes and things like that, where you get second and third pairs of eyes over the way that work's being kind of planned and conducted and that risks are being managed. I don't think it's something that's done very well in, I'm not going to talk about the mining industry, but in industries that we talk about. I think a lot of those processes, which could be designed to be really useful cross-checking processes, are done more as kind of tick and flick type compliance activities rather than genuine, I'm going to check your parachute and you check mine, because if we don't check it well, one of us isn't going to have a parachute that opens. But that you really want to be in a situation where people are you don't have single points of failure in your system around someone who can misinterpret something, and then it can lead to a really dangerous situation. The third one there is one that I think is, we'll talk about they're probably all of the same importance, but sensitivity to operations is one that I think is really, really important to understand. And that means that all decisions in the organisation get made through a lens of what's the impact, what does this mean for the operation? Attention and focus and resources from the organisation are always prioritised and directed towards what the frontline operations needs. So not what head office needs, it's what the mine site needs. And the decisions that head office make are being made through the context of what will this decision mean for the operation. So 30 years ago, like the example that he pulls out when he's talking about this theory is saying, who gets to decide what the budget looks like for the next 12 months? You know, what's the role of operations in vetoing corporate budget and budget reduction? So if we all think of, say, Texas City, for example, and BP globally setting cost reduction targets applied to OPEX for maintenance, that's this lack of sensitivity to operations. What decisions am I making? What resources am I providing or removing? What constraints am I imposing on operations, and what's that going to mean for day-to-day work? So this idea that organisations are always field focused, are always thinking through all of their decisions and what it means for the operations. So the organisation should have a model of how the operation functions and making sure its decisions are consistent with making sure it continues to support that the operations to continue to work. So I think that's quite a shift for a lot of organisations to really contemplate how they do that. I don't know how it works in mining with mine managers and so on, and how much involvement they have and the relative power balance or imbalance between site leadership roles and site technical roles and corporate leadership and corporate technical roles. But this sensitivity operations kind of doesn't worry about the hierarchy. It really looks at how these decisions get made and how the organisation's working to support the operations through everything it does. This the fourth one there is commitment to resilience. So this is basically where this was the first idea that you're not going to be able to prevent everything from going wrong. You can't control and prescribe the way that work is going to run every single day. So it's basically saying, stuff will happen, and we need to be able to detect that as soon as it's starting to happen or change or adjust, and we need to be able to correct it. So this is saying we need to balance our resource and effort towards prevention. So it used this language. It said error prevention and error containment. So that's where the first idea that there's a mistake before it becomes a problem, and people will be familiar with. It's used by a lot of safety leadership programs as an example of, the young, I don't even know if it's a real example, but the young guy, the worker on the aircraft carrier, which is the picture that I showed you on the previous slide, about, they have to account for every single tool and every single piece of equipment on that landing deck before anything can land. And it's the story of the person who couldn't account for a shifter or a spanner or something, and then went straight up to the senior person and said, look, I can't find this thing, and had to divert, 8, 10, depending on who you hear the story from, 8, 10 aircraft to other onshore landing fields. And that being something that was perfectly acceptable and fine. Cost time, cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, disrupted the whole logistics of the operation. But, the idea that person gets marched up on the deck to a standing ovation from the entire crew and given some sort of commendation from the captain and say, you know what, that's the commitment to resilience. Being able to have the ability to know that the slightest thing that starts to go wrong, we're going to sort of jump on it. The other thing that they found sort of going back in this space is that these operations that are high reliability are continuously learning and training. So learning how to do their work. And that's why it's been sort of done to in the healthcare sector and the emergency services area. Like if you think about firefighters, they're constantly drilling and training themselves for firefighting activities. Their training looks no different to their work. They're drilling each other, and so or drilling in the work practices. And the same with pilots in flight simulators, and the same with military operations during peacetime. They're constantly doing simulated work activities, and this is, I think, a big gap for organisations to do. How much work simulation training do you do? So, forget about classroom-based safety training, teaching people to identify a hazard. How do we think about where the opportunity exists in the mining sector to do like simulation training? Because that's where you teach people the capacity to understand what's normal and understand how to identify what might not be normal, and give people chances to apply different types of responses and learn from that kind of experience. One thing that you have to do, though, if you have a commitment to resilience, is you have to be able to accept and support improvisation. Because the way that people deal with the unexpected or when things start to go wrong is they take local action. And so this is again where we start to bridge. You'll see quite a lot of bridges in HRO theory to very current theories. I mentioned safety too earlier, but safety differently in resilience engineering, because this is really giving people the autonomy and the authority, if you like, to make local decisions, to adjust their work practices, to modify their resources, and to make decisions that they need to move their work around. So they need to recombine actions, they need to draw in resources and do certain things, and that's part of this commitment to resilience. And then the last one there is deference to expertise. And this is also a really important one. So I sort of see this one and sensitivity to operations as being, really interesting. And this basically says that normal hierarchical rank does not get applied to operational decisions. So this might be is what should be the maintenance schedule for, or what should be the inspection schedule for the structural integrity of the tailings dam, for example. And that decision should not be made by a manager with no technical knowledge of engineering or that. So in these sort of dynamic, complex operational environments, people value expertise and experience more than they value rank and hierarchy. And I think organisations have moved away from this a lot over the last 10 years. And this came out of the Nimrod investigation when Sir Haddon Cave investigated the Nimrod crash. He said, organisations should value the grey-haired engineers that are sitting around their organisation with 40 years of experience in these activities, and they should be the organisation should see them as the most valuable people if they're running these types of technical operations. And I think organisations have valued the no offence, the young MBAs and the functional roles like the HRs and the health and safety roles and these types of things, because they're week in, week out prominent in the organisation. But an organisation, particularly like a mining company, should look at what's the standing and the decision rights and the capability within your engineering team, and what decisions do they make, and how do they get engaged in decision making? Going back to the budgeting decisions, how does the engineering team get involved in work planning and budgeting, or is it something that they just get given by management as this is the project and this is the timing and this is the budget and try and figure it out? So that deference to expertise is one that's probably really one of the harder ones for an organisation to get its head around, because it's sort of, you kind of have to do that before you need it. You need to figure out what roles, responsibilities, accountabilities look like, and what decisions are going to be made by who and through what involvement of who as well. But one of the things I would say, if we say these are the 5 principles, is this theory is probably as close as any safety theory gets to being practical. And I don't say that lightly. There's safety culture theories. Behavioural safety is very practical, but it's quite narrow and not comprehensive, and it doesn't really tell you what to do at an organisational level. So this theory really actually has a lot of practical stuff in it. And I reread Wyke and Sutcliffe's book, which is somewhere. Yeah, this is what it looks like. I'll show you this resource later, but it's back to front anyway. So that is a really good read. It's 30 years old, and I got heaps of practical stuff out of it. They've designed a whole lot of really practical stuff, and it's a bit of a shame that in the 30 years since, safety theory has moved away to be less practical and less helpful in a lot of ways. So if we think about moving to the practical application then of HRO, what I want to sort of leave as these messages is it is possible to assess your organisation against these principles. So when you're starting out on this and you want to go, well, I could do a culture assessment, I could do a climate assessment, you can do an assessment against these principles. Now, I am not aware of it being done too many times in too many organisations, but there are criteria available. It wouldn't be difficult to customise for the mining sector a sort of a questionnaire to ask some of these questions. How much does management consider operational impacts when it makes capital decisions for the organisation? How to what extent does the engineering team get involved in project scoping, whatever the questions might be. You guys all have better questions than me for your industry, but it would be possible to benchmark and baseline your organisation against that, and that's probably something that it should be a practical takeaway for you guys in the mining sector, because I know organisations like to know where it's starting from and then how to move forward. The other thing that it does, like I said, is that HRO theory really describes the way that organisations are designed, managed and functions, and particularly in those aspects required for high reliability operations. So it talks, the detail of the theory, or as it's being worked out basically through the 90s and into the early 2000s, it describes quite practically some of those things I've said. You can think of the implications for how you structure your organisation. You can think of the implications for who's accountable and responsible for what. So it really does give you those management aspects and organisational design aspects. And so there's a big therefore on this slide. Please, if you can take something, don't let your organisation think that HRO is like a frontline culture or behavioural change program. This is not going out, pulling all your people into a training room, telling them about HRO theory, telling them to be more sensitive to their operations, telling them to report near misses, and then telling them to consult with experts before they make any decisions. Organisations have done that and they've made no progress. I think Dr. Brady in his report, he basically extrapolated it out to be that simple. If you read, I don't know how many have read the report, but he basically took the whole of HRO theory and just said it's about reporting near misses and investigating them before they become fatalities. Okay, like I said, preoccupation with failure says you pay attention to near misses, but really the broad application of HRO theory is much more than that. And you could, I worry that the industry might go and say, well, we need to do a HRO program. Let's develop some communication material and some training material and train our people. But really, HRO requires you to think about, I suppose, what the priorities are for your organisation, how you run your operation, and who makes decisions. And then, obviously, particularly in a mining organisation or a large organisation, it would be, how do we think about the balance and relationship between on-site and off-site, for managing the operation. So that's all I kind of really wanted to say as an overview. Really keen, Christian, if we got some questions, it'd be really good if you ask difficult questions. I can see a few in there. So how do you want to do this, Christian?
Yeah, so we'll, Amy sitting beside me is keeping a log of the questions. So we've got them all listed here, and then we'll start to fire them at you, Dave.
Let's go.
To put you in the hot seat there.
Yeah, let's do it.
What have we got here? So here's a private question. So move from zero incident harm as a target to a more realistic reduction in incidents through a deeper understanding of what and how. Not sure if you can grasp that as a question. I'll come back to you on that one. So here's the next one. You mentioned at the beginning that Safety 2 and other references. How is HRO and Safety 2 related, and how can I apply that in mining? Okay,
so there's a family of safety theory. If I say there's a group of safety theories, HRO was that me who drew on the slide? Someone drew on the slide. So there's a family theory. So HRO was definitely one of the early ones. So one of the first that talked about safety being the presence of capacities within an organisation to make things go well. And for those familiar with Safety 2, you'll be very familiar with that kind of language. And then in the early 2000s, resilience engineering came out. It sort of built on HRO theory a little bit more. And now we've got Safety 2 and Safety Differently in the last 10 to 15 years or so. So there's a lot of overlap. If you drew a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap. It's probably a topic for a long discussion. I think what really needs to happen when you think about the practical application is I'd encourage people to get a bit of an understanding about these different types of safety theories and then pull out the pieces that are relevant for your own context and turn that into your strategy, if you like, for how you're going to move forward. So how to apply that in mining, I think, some of the examples that I gave earlier, mining industry is unique, but it's not that unique that what works in some other industries might not work, in a local context specific way within mining. So I think we'll talk about that. If I was going to start applying this in mining, the good thing about HRO is you can start at a site level. So you don't necessarily have to go and get your board and your executive to say, we're going to run this entire program across our entire organization. You could just do this within, say, your engineering team. Now, there's going to be handoff points between that team that then they're going to have to go and broker with other teams in the organization to make sure that they can actually do the work as they need to. But you can start this within a department, you can start this within a team, you can start this within a site. So that'd be sort of my recommendation to get it really practical.
I think, Dave, and we've done a little bit of pre-work on some examples there, or some example questions, and I think you've probably then touched on that first one there, which was one thing that I was wondering about, is we have disparate geographic locations, even with on a mine site. We've got multi-site organisations, and sometimes a lot of things are top-down. Sometimes we've got work groups that, even though they're on the same site, never actually interact with each other. And sometimes another site might be the converse, where everyone is all together in a bucket. And there's a lot of variability in that structure. And I'm just wondering if you might have any other key points there, or things for us that maybe we could consider, in light of that variability.
Look, I think with any implementation, the bigger that you make I suppose the bigger your eyes are when you're starting the implementation, the harder and the slower and harder it will be to manage and to see action. So if you had a mine site with 1,000 people and a huge geographic diversity, it might take you 6 months to get something off the ground. And then once you get it off the ground, to try to coordinate 1,000 people and to try to manage the understanding and the change process around that would be very difficult. So I'd very much encourage people to think of how they scale this, and I think they need to learn as they're doing. Everyone needs to learn as they're doing it, what it means for them. So I would think the implementation looks quite different for different sites and different companies. And I'd be going back to, okay, so what are the key things that we think are going to have the biggest impact based on where we are in these 5 principles? So if we go deeper into those 5 principles, you might come up with a list of 10 things, or 8 or 10 things or less, that you really want to change. And like I said, it might be some of those things around decision making. It might be some of those things around how much resource you invest in monitoring subtle changes in the operation. It might be how much time you spend, where you reallocate your safety training, or some of your training budgets and things like that. How you look at some of those paperwork processes and try to make them more valuable for simplify, for removing the tick and flick type of thing. So then I'd come up with what those 6 or 8 things that I really wanted to change were, and then I just make sure I change them. And by starting small and then building on that success by broadening it out to a whole site, and then maybe broadening it out to a whole company. But I would be trying, if I was the head of safety, I would be trying to prove it up in a part of a site or on an individual site, and then using that to take it across multi-sites.
Nice, thanks very much, Dave. So there's a comment in the question actually here from Tim, talking about the US military. Probably not, well, maybe it's a bit different here from Australia, where their roles are prescriptive with no flexibility in their work. And in Australia, we need to do more with less. So what does that mean for HRO in Australia? Like, is there seeing those cultural differences there, or maybe those difference in practices there? Is there any learnings there?
So look, it's a really good, it's a good comment and question, Tim. Yeah. So look, that was one of the things that was noted, and it's the same for air traffic control. There, the way that stuff happens is very well drilled, and even though they're very dynamic environments, they're very repeatable environments. So if you've got people with broad roles, with broad roles operating in very differing environments every day, it can be hard to identify when things are changing and when things are different, because things are changing and different every day. So these are just some of the things where it doesn't necessarily make it possible or impossible, but like any safety theory, a safety theory is not a template to drop in your organization. A safety theory is a collection of of sort of a collection of ideas that we then need to interpret through the lens of our own local operating context. So I say it would make... So in Australia and in mining, I'd say HRO would be difficult unless we designed what HRO looks like within the context of mining to account for those differences. So I guess that would be the answer, that it's only going to be successful if we adapt it to the context.
Next question for you. So this is around, is there a specific line to follow to implement HRO for remote functions and remote safety management in mining? That's, we deal a lot with remote decisions.
So by remote, you mean calling back to head office? It's going to be hard to ask, but if I assume that means calling back to head office to get a decision made, then I'm sure that that's probably either that's what it means, or someone out in a remote part of a site calling back to the admin building and asking the safety person or the engineer for a piece of information. Look, there's probably two things that I'd say here. One is having a repeatable way for that to actually happen, so that there's no gaps in communication and understanding. So that's why the communication between the pilots and the air traffic control is so well drilled, so that there's no confusion between whether the pilots have understood what air traffic control want them to do. So if you're making remote decisions and remote functions, I'd be trying to look at what those remote decisions that you're making are, and then I'd be able to try and come up with protocols around how the information gets provided in relation to that decision, because that's going to prevent these gaps in understanding. And so a decision being made, not with all the context that could be available. Now, the second part to this question is something like augmented reality. So the applications now available and rapidly being deployed in mining and resources, and by companies like Realware, that actually have very small head-mounted things where the person in the field looking at something can be talked through and can provide real-time video and information and straight back to the person in the remote area. And that's deployed right now in a lot of remote type operations. Better having protocols around communication if it's verbal, or thinking about if these are really important decisions, operational and safety critical decisions, thinking about augmented reality solutions going forward as part of your safety strategy would be something to contemplate.
Question from Ryan. So aside from the recommendations in the Brady report, how would you recommend approaching senior management to get them engaged in adopting this process shift? That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, so I think that so the good thing about high reliability organisational theory is it actually doesn't have the word safety in the theory title. So what you're actually saying, like at the end of the day, these organisations, one of the things that defines these organisations is managing safety is a core part of what they do. Like if you're in air traffic control, like your number one job is to not have planes, be in the same part of the sky at the same time. If you're a firefighter, your number one thing is, don't die. And if you can put the fire out, put it out. And the same in aircraft carriers. So that means that managing safety is part of their core business. And so that's a little bit different when it comes to the resources sector of mining, no matter how much we'd like to either say that that's the case or believe that that's the case. Core business and safety are sort of coupled, but also can be sort of separated as well. So to answer your question, Ryan, what I would do is I would say this is an operations strategy. This is not necessarily a safety strategy, because you guys want to be reliable in your production, no question. So having people think about safety and operations in a fully integrated way, so that the slight deviation in the way that work's happening could be an operational problem, or it could be a safety problem, or whatever, but it doesn't matter. We need to understand it. So I'd be trying to sell it to senior management about this is an operations strategy, and then you talk about what's bad about these things. Having the person who's got the most knowledge be heavily involved in decision-making process, that's a good thing. Make sure we're not making any decisions that make life hard for our operations, that compromise production or safety on site. So I'd be trying to then package up the theory in a way that said, this is good for production and safety, And these 5 or 6 outcomes that the theory is trying to chase are good for, basically just good for the way that we should run our business. So hopefully that helps, Ryan. I think this is probably an easier thing to get across than a lot of safety specific stuff that you might get across with your management.
Agreed. I had a pre-prepared question, but someone else has already beat me to it here around what can we learn from the oil and gas industry, because obviously they had a crack at this, and challenges, successes that we could potentially take away.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Shona. So look, yes. So why did the oil and gas industry pick it up? So the oil and gas story is not actually that different to what's happening right now for you guys in mining. What sort of happened was early in the early 2000s, Professor Andrew Hopkins wrote a book called Learning from High Reliability Organisations. Looks like this. And then what happened was Texas City happened in 2005, and then he wrote a book called Failure to Learn. And he heavily basically threw a lot of his high reliability stuff from his earlier book into how that would have helped avoid Texas City. So the oil and gas industry picked this up in the late 2000s, and I don't know how much of it's going on at the moment in the oil and gas industry. But look, I think what my advice, my conclusions here, Shona, I'm not inside all of these organisations. Probably the mistake they made is they tried to treat it like a culture change program, all about communication, all about education, all about the frontline workforce and things like that. And I don't think those organisations really changed the way that they operate, changed their organisational priorities, changed the way that decisions got made, and all of those things that I said earlier. I know that's probably on the harsh side and the challenges side, but I'm not sure of the successes side. It's probably a good question to go away and have a look. I'll go and see if there's anything that's been published out of the oil and gas industry, but given BP ran a program in between Texas City and Macondo, I'm not sure that maybe they, maybe there's some experiences there. I know, cool. You might have some personal experience, Shona, from your time in downstream at BP.
Okay, so question here from Neville. So he said that HR principles are management. Is there an opportunity to pitch HRO at different levels of the business?
So look, I think there's definitely an opportunity to pitch HRO at different levels. Like, I mean, if you're working with say a board, and so we do a bit of work with board committees, so like company sustainability committees or HSEC committees or something like that with subsets of board members. So thinking about the board's activities and the executive management's activities is really useful through a HRO perspective. So how is the board getting expert advice for it to make decisions? Is it deferring to expertise, or is it just making decisions because it's the board? Operation critical decisions. And so these are ways that you can think of it definitely at different levels. You can think of this, like I said, you can think of this as at a maintenance or engineering team level. You could think of this as your safety team level. Pilot it within your safety team. Think about, how do we do our work now? How would these principles change the way that we would do our work? And therefore, kind of like, what do we want to try for ourselves? So you could definitely do it at team, site, and right up through to board level. But again, it's about context and thinking about the principles and then thinking about kind of what it means for that operation or that group of people.
Thanks, Dave. And look, if anyone else got questions, feel free to throw them out there. Dave, I guess you have covered this a bit, the where to start, start small, get focused, all that sort of stuff. And then we have talked a little bit about resource constrained work environments. Everyone's busy, everyone's flat out. The risk here is it is another thing that overwhelms or is seen as another thing. So is there any additional thoughts you might have there around that, where to start? If we're overwhelmed, there's a lot going on, anything else that you might want to add? So
you could start by taking the stuff away in your organisation that's inconsistent with the principles of HRO. So, and by that I mean sort of like having, and people might be familiar with terms like, decluttering or something like that. There's an opportunity here to like I said, you're not just going to add more and the same. And I think that might be a pitfall of people who have done not actually changed anything, just overlaid these HRO ideas in terms of communication on top of everything they're doing. So you can start to take stuff away. But like I said earlier, I mean, I don't know how hard some of this stuff is. Like, next time your site's prepare, the next time your company's doing its budget, how's the safety department and the sites and the engineering team involved in that budgeting process? Like, just asking your organisation the question. How do we know we've got all the information we need to put a budget together that's sensitive to the operation? So I think if we think of this as these things as big programs, they're hard to sell to organisations, they're hard to do, and they're hard to sustain. That's why I've been encouraging people to pick up a couple of key things. And it wouldn't be hard for us to work out. It wouldn't be hard for you to work out in your organisations what those things that you think are your biggest vulnerabilities at the moment in relation to understanding and managing your operation reliably, and then trying to make those changes within your organisation. But while you're at it, I'd take the opportunity to remove a lot of the stuff that's being done in the name of safety that isn't really adding any value. If you take stuff away, people are going to be probably more happy for you to put some new stuff in.
Good. We've got a message here from Nicole around all the books relevant to HRO, which I think we've got a little bit later in one of the wrap-up slides there. So we've got that one there, Nicole. And here's an interesting question, actually. So the Brady report's recommending HRO be applied. Is the industry as a whole going to create framework, or is it going to be a free-for-all, potentially allowing too much individual interpretation? So I'd probably guess straight away it's going to be the latter. But that would be an interesting thing. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts around that, Dave.
I don't know how, this would be I don't even know anymore. I'm not close enough, being on the outside of organisations, I'm not close enough anymore, but I don't know the current status of the Queensland Resources Council, for example, or I don't know about the Australian mining industry bodies or things like that. I mean, it would be a great opportunity for the mining industry to come together and try to share and learn and design something. It's happening in a number of industries around safety. I know it happens in utility sector and it happens in oil and gas, try to come up with some common frameworks for how to do this and leverage and support each other. Those things are always slow though, and they're always a compromise between what each organisation wants, or if you've got one company that's got the loudest voice, they get what they want. So I think it's going to be company by company. And so we are going to have people who oversimplify this theory and set their corporate comms teams off to spray some stuff around their business. And I suppose that's, so, for everyone on this call who's taking the time to try to understand it, there's a lot more, we'll talk about a few options, but I think, we can spend more time together going deeper into the theory and even co-designing some stuff if we want to. But there will be a big push. I mean, if I was a board or a CEO now or involved in as you guys, probably many of you guys are in the mining industry in Queensland, and if you had it would be hard to not be doing something. And so when people are pushed into doing something that they may not want to or may not understand, then we're going to have not valuable stuff happen.
Okay, we will continue.
So there's a comment there.
Bobby's comment there. Yeah.
Cool.
So I'll read it out. QRC had organised to get Andrew Hopkins to the annual safety conference to run workshops on HRO for company leaders, and it's on hold now due to COVID-19.
Okay. Oh, that would have been good. That would have been a good thing. That would have been a really good thing to have happen. Very much. So
we'll pause at the question bit. Look, if you do have more questions after this or further on the call, get them to us, either email or whatever, and I'm sure we can work out, and Dave can have a look at and get some responses back out to everyone. Conscious of time, so we'll move into the wrap-up phase here. So the where to next, I'm all a bit big about this. What can we do? Where can we start? Dave, thank you very much. You've given us some good insights there. That's a good takeaways for people. So maybe then the resources and Nicole is definitely for you.
Yeah, so look, so I just collected a few little things as we were doing this, and so when you get these slides come out, which Christian will explain, is the UK HSE executive, they commission some really good reports regularly, or, like relatively regularly. And so they did a literature review of high reliability organisation theory and papers and academic publications. And that's a good paper there. Dave Woods, Professor Dave Woods and Sydney Decker did a book chapter on a HRO perspective, which does some of that bridging between HRO and safety too, that was in one of the earlier comments, and basically says, where's HRO come over the last 20 years and some future direction stuff, and that's available through Sydney Decker's website. Like Christian said earlier, shameless plug here, I do co-host the Safety at Work podcast with Dr. Drew Ray at Griffith Uni. We did an episode 14 on some research paper that had been done in a healthcare organisation where we talked about the characteristics of a HRO in a practical setting. Now, it's nothing to do with mining because we're talking practically about how hospitals run for this study, but you might get something out of it. And there's some overview of the theory in that podcast. And then we also did quite a long podcast on the Brady report, which to spoil that, we're pretty disappointed in the report, both theoretically and practically. And then there's those two books that I held up at various times. I think Shona had said at some point that Managing the Unexpected is available on Audible or as an audio book somewhere. So for those of you guys, which is probably most of you in the industry who have a lot of windscreen time, you can listen to that book. And so if you were going to pick something up, I would recommend Managing the Unexpected, and then Hopkins' book, which is Learning from High Reliability Organisations. They're probably the two main recommended books. But if people want other resources, they can just come to me and what specifically they're looking for, and I'll try and dig something out for them.
Right.
So what I kind of thought, Christian, when we were thinking about this, what offer do we want to make to you guys, and what might you do? So Christian and I, as with a lot of people outside of organisations now, things are lucky. I think Christian and I are both lucky that we're still pretty busy, but we do have quite a bit of capacity as well. So if you want to get a few people in your organisation together to discuss HRO in a little bit more deeply and a little bit more in relation to your specific context, and have some people in your organisation, even if it might just be your safety team or something, ask some questions about it and start to form up some ideas for you and your organisation, then we're happy to do that. We can run that as kind of like a learning team, just directly with you guys, customize it, ask you a few questions beforehand, and come ready to help you kind of figure out what you might do. The third point there is, when you send through some feedback, if you want to do some longer form webinar content, like I can, some of you who know me, like I can pull together a 2 or 3 hour lecture on HRO stuff if you guys are interested in listening to something like that. But if this was really just a 15-20 minute overview, but I'd also be happy to do more of a longer form lecture style webinar if there was a desire to get much deeper into the theory and much deeper into some of the research findings around the theory. Happy to do that as well. And in that middle point there, Christian and I are going to look to work to help where we can the mining industry, work together and partner with my team and Christian's team. And so we are going to sort of pull together some of these tools and be ready for when organisations say, well, actually, we do want to implement something to do with safety, with HRO within our organisation. And so we're sort of pulling together the maturity assessment sort of criteria and tools and things like that. If any of your organisations want to go, you know what, we really want to understand where we're at with this, and we want to make a plan to move forward, then we can. We're sort of standing up ourselves ready to help where you want to as well. So give us some of that feedback, particularly if you want a follow up webinar with your team, or if you want a longer form lecture style webinar, and we can make that happen.
Thanks, Dave. And I'll probably just add there, and Dave, you and I think you used the term the whiplash that may come post COVID-19, where people recognise all of these other bits of stuff and strategies and plans and everything that have been paused at the moment, and certainly the response to the Brady report, or what organisations are doing to demonstrate a response or an implementation plan. I suspect there'll be a lot of activity very, very quickly. So look, I encourage you, Dave, you can see he knows it very well. Reach out, send the email, ask the questions to see how we can start to progress forwards on that. Final logistics, we'll package these slides up, send them out to the people on the call. And, as Dave made reference to, really, really interested in what we can learn or what I can learn, or both of us together, as a result of this call, the content, the format, structure, everything. Really appreciate any feedback you can share with that via email, voice, phone, whatever works. So look, that's the end of the content. That's the end of the structure. We're just about being on time. Dave, any last thoughts or comments from your end?
My only thought would be spend the time making sure that your organisations understand it, and you understand it before you launch in. I think our careers are all littered. My career is definitely littered with failed safety implementations just because I didn't understand what I was trying to do. So yes, I think and starting small. Don't have your eyes too big, because change is hard, and some of these changes are quite fundamental. So a well-designed small intervention would be where I'd be starting. This.
Excellent. Well, look, Dave, on behalf of all of us on the call, appreciate your time and your sharing there of information. Certainly that pragmatic approach and evidence-based approach. I appreciate everyone's time who are on the call as well. It's an hour on a Wednesday night, and hopefully you've got something out of that. And so thank you very much. We'll wrap the call up now, and we'll be in communication in the future. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.